Good evening, lover of dark stories. Did you come for the story? Or did the story come for you? If you're here, it's because you enjoy the kind of tales that linger in your mind, the ones that haunt you for days. And tonight, I have a story that will stay with you far longer than you imagine. You probably wouldn't believe it, but what I'm about to tell you is something many people in a small town in Pennsylvania wish they could forget. But stories like this aren't so easily erased. Now that you're here, I hope you're comfortable. Put on your headphones, light a candle, and pay close attention. I won't bother interrupting this tale with a bunch of ads. So, without further delay, let's begin. It's 1875. We're in a forgotten town in Texas. A place that doesn't appear on maps, yet somehow still carries the scars of a dark past. A town that time has not forgiven, where the winds are cold and the streets empty. But that afternoon, a group of children, with curiosity bubbling in their veins, ventured into what seemed to be an ordinary house. But deep down, it hid secrets that even time hadn't managed to erase. I was with them. Just another child, eager for adventures, unaware that fate was about to show us that some things should never be unearthed. The smell of the place was unmistakable. A mix of old wood, mold, and something undefined. Something I would only understand later. The interior of the house was in complete abandonment. The windows were covered with wooden planks. The doors creaked under the weight of time. But the attraction was irresistible, and there we went, without hesitation. We climbed the creaking stairs, venturing deeper into what seemed to be the heart of the house, the attic. It was locked, but one of the bolder kids grabbed a rusty key and opened the door. The air there was heavy, stifling, as if the attic held secrets so ancient that even time had dared not reveal them. When the door opened, the sound of creaking wood made my heart race. And then, there it was. An aged chest, covered in dust and marked with traces that seemed to have been made by hands that had been dead for a long time. But what really disturbed me was the symbolism on the chest. It was a strange drawing, almost familiar, yet impossible to comprehend. It was as though those symbols were speaking directly to my soul. When the lid of the chest opened, a deep silence took over all of us. Inside, a game. It wasn't just any game. It looked like it had been made centuries ago. The pieces were made of a dark material, almost like bone. The wooden box was covered with symbols that reminded me of something dark. Something I didn't want to believe was real. But at that moment, no one questioned it. We just wanted to know what would happen. And so, we began to play dot at that moment. The game seemed harmless. It was just a distraction, a form of entertainment on a boring afternoon. But there was something strange in the air. I can't explain it. Something was watching us. The air grew colder, the shadows seemed denser, and the echo of our laughter slowly faded. Every move we made seemed to be watched by something, or someone that was waiting. At first, the game was easy. We all laughed and played, unaware that it wasn't fun, but a trap. The first sign came with the loss of one of us, Alex. He was suddenly gone, as if the ground had opened up beneath his feet, and he had simply vanished. Panic began to spread, but no one wanted to believe what was happening. We tried to continue, but something was wrong. The game wasn't normal. The rules were cruel, and we were trapped in its web. When we lost a round, it wasn't just a simple loss. The sensation was that something or someone was watching us, waiting for the right moment to act. And we, innocently, kept ignoring the signs. The game controlled us. And with every round, the air became heavier. The feeling that we were being watched, that something or someone was approaching, became more and more palpable. It wasn't just shadows anymore. There was something else. Something real. Now, with Alex gone, we could no longer ignore the gravity of what we had done. But it was when I realized that the game had something far more serious in mind. This wasn't just a pastime. The game was sucking us in, pulling us toward a fate we couldn't escape. Our fear only grew. But the worst was yet to come. I didn't know yet, but every move I made, every breath I took, was leading me to the center of something no one could foresee. What happened to Alex was just the beginning. I didn't know at the time, but I could feel deep down in my soul that something far worse was waiting for us. It was as if the game knew what each of us feared most, and was willing to make that fear become reality. There were no more laughs, no more fun. Fear took hold of us with every movement, and we didn't know how to stop. What was before us, in that dusty attic, was not just a game. It was a connection to something much darker. An entity that, with the calmness of a hunter waiting for its prey, watched our steps, knew our weaknesses, and fed off them. I saw the reflection of the game in her eyes. Fear was growing. And with every loss, the game pieces became clearer, more present. We tried to stop, but the dice wouldn't allow it. I remember seeing the others trying to scream, as if they were in a nightmare, where they couldn't wake up. That sound, the sound of the pieces sliding on the wooden board, it was hypnotic. It echoed in my mind like the distant call of something I couldn't understand. But one thing I knew for sure, we no longer had control. The game was in command. Let's stop, someone said. But the suggestion was in vain. When we tried to stop playing, the pieces seemed to move on their own, as if being pulled by an invisible force. The silence in the attic became so heavy that you could feel a pressure in your chest. I looked around and realized that something had changed. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were moving, as if they had their own will. That's when we saw the symbols on the cards. Before, everything seemed so abstract, something simple and harmless. But now, the symbols seemed to be burning on the pages. I saw the drawing of the devil, not just any drawing, but the image of an infernal being, a presence from another world, with eyes as empty as death. The smell of something burning began to spread through the room. I don't know how to describe it, but it was as if something was rotting around us, and we were the rats in the trap. That's when the second of us disappeared. Clara. I saw her vanish, as if she had been swallowed by the air. A sigh, a scream that echoed through the house. We tried to run, scream, do anything to bring her back, but nothing worked. She was no longer there. She hadn't left. She simply didn't exist anymore, as if she had been erased. Nothing else could explain what was happening. I was beginning to understand. This game wasn't just a game. It had taken us to another place, something much older. The chest, the symbols, the house, they were all part of a ritual, a pact, made many years ago, when the town was still alive. The people who lived in that house weren't just ordinary people. I knew that now. They had brought the game here, and now it was consuming us. But what truly terrified us was that the game pieces were starting to disappear. The board, the dice, everything. A chess piece, for example, disappeared from my hand, vanished as if it had been absorbed by an invisible force. The feeling that there was no going back was overwhelming. One by one, we were being consumed by something we couldn't comprehend. When the third one disappeared, I could no longer hold back the panic. The game, or whatever it was swallowing us. And I knew, somehow, that I would be next. There was no more time, no more escape. The walls began to close in. The environment of the house seemed to distort, as if it were being molded by an invisible force. I tried to leave, but the house's door was locked. There was no way out. I was trapped there, with a game I couldn't understand, with forces beyond my capacity for reasoning, controlling everything around me. That's when I found the diary dot. It was lying in a corner, among the shadows. Piece of old paper, with dark stains that looked like blood, but it didn't smell like rotting flesh. I opened the diary and began to read. The writing was anguished, frantic, as if someone had written it under pressure, knowing that time was running out. What I read changed everything. The man who had created the game, or rather, the one who brought it there, was condemned. He had made a pact with an evil entity, promising his soul in exchange for power and wealth, but he didn't know. Or maybe he knew, but chose to ignore. That the true promise of the game wasn't just to take a soul. It was to trap the souls in an eternal winter, in a state of eternal torment. The players never left, and the game continued forever. The man had been swallowed by his own pact, and those who played from that moment on would become part of an endless cycle of horror. The words began to spin before my eyes. The air thickened, and I felt as if I was being pulled into the book, as if it had a life of its own. Then, I looked at the board again. It was as if it had called me. I knew that the only way to escape was to play. There was no choice. The only thing that could set us free was to complete the game. But with every round, with every move, the terror became more palpable. With the last bit of courage I had left, I decided to play. The final match was about to begin, and when the pieces moved, everything around me started to crumble. The final game began with a deadly silence. The air, thick and icy, seemed to freeze our bones. The house, already distorted and deformed, was molding itself around us, as if the very environment was trying to swallow us whole. I knew that what came next would have no turning back. Somehow, the game had already started consuming our essence, turning each breath into something heavier, more desperate. I looked at the others. Their eyes were empty, as if they were seeing something beyond me, beyond what was before us. The loss of Clara and Alex had changed all of us in ways we didn't even understand. Something had been broken in each of us, as if our own fears and regrets were materializing into shadows. But the worst part was that the more we tried to move away from the board, the more it pulled us back, as if an invisible force was keeping us there. And so, we began to play. I felt the weight of the pieces in my hands, as if they were made of molten iron. The sensation was oppressive. With each move, a part of me was bidding farewell, making way for a fear I no longer knew how to control. But something worse happened. The game began to react differently. The pieces, once simple, started glowing with a dark light, and the symbols in their centers became alive, pulsing, as if they were breathing. It was no longer just a game. Now it was an entity, a being feeding on us. The board expanded. It seemed to stretch, distorting the space around us, creating hallways that hadn't been there before. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the walls, but no one was moving. Fear became a physical presence, something we could touch, feel, but couldn't escape. I knew that if we played again, something even worse would happen. But there was no choice. The game had already become a prison, and somehow, I knew that the only way to break the curse was to play it to the end. If we could survive it. Suddenly, a shadow materialized in front of me. A dark figure that seemed to have come out of our worst nightmares. It didn't speak, but its presence was deafening, as if the very air was twisting around it. I knew who it was. It was the entity that created the game, the force behind everything we were experiencing. The devil, in all his glory, was there, waiting. The thing, or the being, looked at us with lifeless eyes, but filled with malice. When it spoke, its voice was like a scream from the bottom of a well, cold and distant. "You think you can escape?" it said, the voice reverberating through the room. "You're already lost, children. There's no turning back." Fear took over me, but also a sense of despair. How could we escape from something that had already trapped us? How could we fight against something so vast, so immense, that seemed to be part of something greater than us? Then, in a desperate move, I began to frantically gather the pieces of the board. I tried to understand the pattern, looking for a flaw, an opening. I knew there wasn't much time. The shadow before us watched every move we made with a chilling attention, as if it were enjoying our desperate struggle. When I placed the final piece in place, the room shook. The floor cracked open, and a deep fissure formed, revealing a darkness so black it seemed to swallow all the light around us. The shadow smiled, and I knew, at that moment, it wouldn't be enough. The board lit up in a terrifying way. The pieces, now moving on their own. A game had come to life, controlling everything, manipulating our actions. The only sound that could be heard was the creaking of the pieces sliding across the board, accompanied by a laugh that didn't seem human. It was as if hell itself was opening beneath our feet. The remaining children tried to run, but the shadows held them. There was no escape. I saw the last child being consumed by the darkness, swallowed by the force of the entity that now controlled everything. I was alone, or almost. I knew the end was near. The game had no more pieces. The board was empty, but the darkness continued to grow, enveloping the entire house, filling it with a sepulchral silence. I tried to stand, but my body felt heavy, as if it were being pulled into the abyss. Then, the devil's voice spoke again. This time closer, more hissing. "You won't escape," it said. "This place, this game, you belong to it now." The last thing I remember was the floor disappearing beneath my feet. The house, the town, everything was consumed by darkness, and I was dragged into a place where time no longer existed. A place where lost souls wander eternally. And then, silence. Complete and utter silence. I don't know how long I was there. I don't know if reality still exists. What I do know is that the game, that cursed game, never disappeared. It's there, somewhere, waiting. And if you find the house, the chest, and start playing, well, maybe you won't know, but the game has already started for you too. I am the last soul, and the others are still there, waiting, playing forever. The silence. It was deep, absolute. I was suspended in a place where time didn't pass, where space didn't exist. Everything around me was submerged in darkness. There was no more light, no sound, just a feeling of emptiness so dense it seemed to crush my soul. I didn't know if I was still in my body, or if I had already been consumed by the darkness, by the very nature of the game. I didn't know if what I was experiencing was eternal torture, or just awaiting for the next victim dot. What was left of me was a thought, a persistent idea. I needed to leave. I needed to understand what had happened. But when I tried to move, I realized there was no body to move. I was there, but at the same time, I wasn't. It was a sensation of total disconnection, as if my mind was trapped in a body that no longer existed. That's when I heard it. A low, dragging whisper, as if made of ancient wind and dust. The words weren't clear, but I knew what they said. "You're still here." The voice was the same as before, the voice of the devil, cold and impersonal. "You thought you could escape? The game never ends." The feeling of despair intensified. What had happened? I had escaped from the house, from the town. That wasn't possible. But now, I understood. I was in another place, a dimension that the game had created, a place where time and space had dissolved. The house no longer existed, the town no longer existed. Only the emptiness and the presence of the game remained. And then, the game spoke to me again, this time directly in my mind. "You, foolish child. You thought destroying the board would end it all? You're just beginning. This is the place where souls are lost, where the losers remain trapped." The idea that I was trapped in an eternal cycle, with no end, haunted me. I didn't know how long I had been there. A day? A month? A year? I couldn't measure time. Perhaps I had been there for centuries, or maybe there was no time at all. But the truth was, I was now part of that game. The fate of everyone else was also intertwined with mine. What terrified me even more was that the game, the entity that controlled it, was feeding on me, on my soul. The darkness around me began to change. It was forming into something more tangible. I could now see outlines of dark shapes emerging from the shadows, as if the very darkness was materializing into distorted figures. They were coming closer, but not touching. They were watching, waiting. The place I was in, this emptiness, seemed to be expanding. I knew the game didn't want me to escape. It had left me here, trapped, waiting for the right moment to begin again. And then, a sinister thought emerged in my mind. The game didn't need more players. It already had its victims. We, those who played, were now in some sort of endless prison. And anyone who came near the house, the town, would be invited to enter. I thought about screaming, but there was no sound, no voice. All I could feel was the presence of that being. The entity that had created the game. The devil, the true creator of torment, was watching, like a spider patiently waiting for its next meal. He knew I couldn't escape, that no soul could. The dark shapes began to move closer to me, surrounding me. They were the lost souls, those who had played before me, the ones condemned to wander through this eternal hell, like pieces on a board that could never leave. I felt the weight of their pain, their loss, and it was as if each of these souls wanted to drag me further into the darkness, into the eternity of the game. The air was heavy, each breath was difficult. They were there, but they were no longer human. They were shadows that had been consumed by all of this. They were waiting for the moment when I would become one of them. Suddenly, something strangely familiar happened. The shadows began to move around me, creating a spiral, and the sound of chess pieces, the sound of the game, began to fill the air. I knew what that meant. The game was about to start again. I was back at the beginning. A new match was starting. The last thing I saw was the glow of the pieces, and the shadows of each lost soul pulling me back into the game. And then, the emptiness deepened again. I didn't know if my soul had been consumed, or if the game was shaping it forever. I only knew that the next time someone approached the house, the chest, they too would be part of the game. And who knows, maybe now, you've caught the game's attention. If you ever find the house, the chest, and decide to play, maybe you'll discover what happens when the game finally chooses you. But remember, the game never ends. I don't know how much time had passed since the game began again. The sensation of time, of space, had disappeared, and all that remained was the game, a presence that filled every part of my being. There was no longer the sensation of being myself. I wasn't sure anymore who I was, or what I was, or if I even really existed. All that remained was the hissing voice that seemed to crawl through my mind, constantly reminding me that I was trapped. But somehow, a part of me still tried to resist. Something inside me knew I should fight, that there was a way out. But the more I tried to escape, the more the game pulled me back. The board in front of me was as real as anything I had ever touched, and with each move, the world around me distorted, bent, as if it were an extension of the game itself, a reflection of what it wanted me to be. The sound of the pieces sliding across the board was the only thing breaking the silence. But what I couldn't understand was the growing feeling that the pieces weren't just moving, they were acting. Each piece was like an entity with its own will, a force that was watching me, judging me. They were in constant motion, and each time a piece touched the board, it was as if I was being dragged just a little further into it. But I wasn't alone. The shadows continued to form around me. The lost souls were there, watching me, waiting. They didn't speak, but their presence was palpable. Each of them represented a lost player, a soul that had been consumed by the game, with no hope of escape. They were there, staring at me with empty eyes, their bodies distorted by the curse of the game. I tried to speak to them, tried to ask for help, but there was no answer. They couldn't hear me. They were trapped, just like me. And then, as if the shadows knew what I was thinking, they began to move. One of them approached me, and the feeling of being pulled toward it was so strong that I could hardly resist. It was as if I were a piece of the game, being moved involuntarily, as if the game had taken control of each one of us. The devil's voice echoed again, but this time, something had changed. It was stronger, more present, as if it were feeding off my pain, my hopelessness. "You thought this would end, didn't you?" it said. Its voice was like a cold whisper. "You think the souls that lost the game are the only ones trapped here? You, my dear, are the last piece." I didn't understand what it meant. The last piece? What did that mean? I looked at the board, at the game unfolding in front of me, and I realized that I was losing more and more of the sense of what was real. The space around me seemed to collapse, as if the very world was falling apart. I was being dragged into the game, into the board, and the emptiness around me was becoming more and more oppressive. Gradually, the figures of the souls became clearer. They began to group together, forming a line, as if they were preparing for something. I knew what that meant. The game was nearing its final stages, and I would be the next to be consumed, to become part of that endless abyss. But before I could react, the shadows moved faster. They advanced toward the board, one after another, and the sound of the pieces became more frantic, more chaotic. The board was turning into a distortion, the pieces moving on their own, as if something deeper was happening. Time was distorted, and I was being dragged further into the darkness. And then, a cold sensation hit me hard. I looked at my own hand and saw it becoming translucent, almost invisible. My form was disappearing. What remained of me was dissolving, as if I were a shadow about to be erased. The sensation of being consumed by something much greater than I was palpable. I was being pulled into the game. Each part of me was dissolving, and I knew there was no more time. The devil laughed, and that laugh was the last thing I heard before being completely swallowed by the darkness. There was no more body, no more mind. There was only the game, the emptiness, and the lost souls, all waiting for the moment when another player would be drawn to the board. And then the emptiness closed in. There was no more sound, no more light, but somewhere, far, far away, a new soul had been drawn in, and the game began again. Now, only one certainty remained: the game never ends, and those who play it never leave. The darkness consumes them, and the pieces continue to move, waiting for the next victim. I no longer knew who I was or where I was. There was no body, no mind. Only the feeling of being dragged into the eternal void, an invisible force pulling me towards something I could not comprehend. The emptiness around me seemed to stretch on, for all eternity, like a bottomless pit that expanded, swallowing everything that existed, including my essence. And then darkness. Nothing more than darkness. A deep and silent darkness. But somehow, I was still aware. There was still something inside me that understood what was happening, or at least perceived the changes taking place. I could feel the presence of the lost souls, those who had played before me and were now condemned to wander an eternity of endless torment. They were around me, but their figures were distorted, disfigured, as if they had been corrupted by the very nature of the game. Their faces, now unrecognizable, looked at me with a void so deep I could almost touch it. What happened to them? What would happen to me? The game was repeating, and somehow I knew this had no end. There was no escape. The game never ends. It continues forever in an endless cycle. And I was the last piece, the last victim it had marked. The last soul to be dragged into the eternity of the endless winter. I tried to remember something. Anything. I tried to think about my life before all of this. But the memories were fading, evaporating like mist. I no longer knew who I was. I no longer knew what I had been. All I knew was that I was trapped. Trapped in that place at the center of a curse as ancient as time itself. And then something broke the silence. Something moved within the darkness. Something that shouldn't have been there. A new presence, something unknown, seemed to approach me. It was no longer the voice of the devil. It was something even older, deeper. As if the abyss itself had decided to manifest. "Do you still think you can escape?" said the voice. "Now, stronger, deeper. You no longer belong to your reality. Now you are part of the game, and the game never ends." I tried to resist, tried to pull away, but the presence was relentless. There was nowhere to go. The darkness began to shape itself around me, forms taking shape from it, as if they were shadows of something I couldn't understand. It was as though the void itself was becoming solid, creating a new space for me, for all the souls that were there. Then I realized we weren't just pieces of flesh or trapped souls. We were becoming part of the game itself. Our memories, our identities, were being consumed, shaped to become mere pieces on an endless board. The game, which had seemed like just a pastime, a game, was actually the key to an infinite cycle, an endless cycle, where those who lose are consumed, not just physically, but spiritually. I was beginning to understand. Each of us who played, each soul that was lost in the game, was being transformed into something else, something lifeless. A piece, a part of the board. The players were no longer human. They became part of the devil's creation, part of the machine that devours souls. And now I was transforming too. My form was distorting. My body was no longer the same. I was becoming a shadow, an empty figure, an entity that would only exist to serve the game, to serve those who created it. But there was no pain. There was no more suffering. Not anymore, because the transformation wasn't painful. It was, in fact, the loss of what I had been, the loss of everything I could have been. I was no longer me. I was a piece, a part of something much greater, something far more horrible than anything I had imagined. And deep down, at the bottom of my soul, if I could still call it a soul, I knew what would happen next. I knew that someone, somewhere, would find the chest. Someone would find the game, and the cycle would begin again. What I still didn't fully understand was how old the game was. Where had it come from? Who had created it? I knew the game had no beginning or end. It had existed for a long time, and it would continue to exist until all souls were consumed, until the very concept of life and death was corroded by its influence. Perhaps it was impossible to stop the game. Perhaps it was the fate of all of us to be part of it, condemned to live, or rather, to exist in an endless cycle. But the worst of it all is that the game still waits. And who knows, maybe you, by hearing this story, have already attracted its attention. Maybe you are closer than you think. If you ever find the chest, if you ever decide to play, perhaps you will discover, in a horrible way, what happens when the game finally chooses you. I hope you are not the next, because I know, as no one else knows, that the game never ends. And when it chooses you, It will be too late to escape. I don't know how long I've been here. The concept of time disappeared along with everything I once knew. There were no clocks, no days or nights. It was as if I were in an endless space where nothing happened, but at the same time, everything was happening at once. The emptiness surrounded me, and I now found myself being absorbed by it, each piece of me dissolving, becoming a part of the game that had imprisoned me. Yet, a part of me still remembered who I had been, who I could still be. A part of my soul, if I could still call it a soul, resisted, fought against this transformation. But it was a solitary fight. The shadows around me moved, twisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. The lost souls, now even more deformed, looked at me, not with compassion, but with a kind of acceptance. They were trapped, and they knew there was no way out. But something new, something different, was happening now. Something that became more evident with every breath I took. A growing presence was approaching me, like a force, an energy that I couldn't understand. It was as if the void itself was transforming into something solid, something that should not exist. It was the devil. He was here. I didn't know how, but I could feel his presence. He was watching, waiting. He was the force behind all of this, the creator of the game, the being who had woven it with his own hands. What did he want from me? I was already lost. I had already been consumed. He no longer needed me. But still, his presence became stronger, more oppressive, as if he were feeding off my pain, my agony. You still think you can escape? He sighed, his voice dragging like a whisper. You are nothing more than a piece, and pieces cannot escape. I knew he was right. I was no longer a person. I was nothing more than part of the game, part of the curse that stretched across all eternity. I no longer had control. I was trapped, and the game would continue forever. But then, something even more disturbing happened. I saw it. I saw the souls around me beginning to move, beginning to form in a strange way, as if they were being reshaped, as if the game was starting to reorganize itself. It was as if they were being chosen again, as if the cycle was about to repeat itself. I saw the shadows gathering in one direction, all following an invisible path, a path leading to something I couldn't understand. I was being taken as well, powerless to resist. The game was starting again, and I knew there was no way out. But what frightened me the most was when I realized that the direction the souls were going wasn't the void anymore. It was no longer the place where it all had started. No, they were heading toward something new, something worse. A door. I saw the door form in front of me. It appeared from nowhere, as if made of shadows and darkness. A dark door with ancient symbols engraved on its surface. And I knew somehow that this door was not just an exit. It was an entrance. The entrance to the next cycle. The next game. I didn't want to go there. I knew that if I crossed that door, there would be no turning back. I wouldn't be me anymore. I would only be a shadow, a lost soul, a piece in a game that never ends. But what terrified me even more was that I knew I had no choice. The game was in control, and I was just a pawn, moved by the invisible hands of the devil. What I didn't know, what I couldn't understand, was that this door wasn't just a passage. It was the key to a new stage of the game. The devil wasn't just playing with our souls. He was creating something new, something much bigger, something no one could imagine. Once we passed through that door, we would be in a new level, where the rules would be even crueler. I tried to resist, tried to pull away, but the shadows were pulling me toward it. The souls around me were being dragged to the door as well. They had already accepted their fate. They were condemned, and they knew it. The door slowly opened, revealing an even deeper darkness. It was as if the abyss itself was calling me, drawing me into a place where there would be no more escape. And I knew for sure that once we crossed that door, there would be no going back. I now was part of the game. I was a piece, a lost soul, and the cycle was about to begin again. But still, one last question arose in my mind, a question that haunted me until the last moment. Who will be the next? The door before me was not just a passage. It was a sentence. The shadows around me, the lost souls, were all moving toward it, moving as if they already knew what would happen, as if they had been waiting for this for centuries. But there were no choices left for anyone. The devil had already set the rules. There was no escape. The game, that cursed game, had taken over everything. As we neared the door, I felt an indescribable cold. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel when exposed to the wind on a cold night. No. It was the kind of cold that comes from within, a chill that freezes your soul, as if the very essence of who we are was being corroded. The shadows were more intense now, more real, as if they were taking human form, riding in the space around. Emmy. They watched us with a silent hunger, as if they knew that once we entered that door, we would be beyond help. The devil, somewhere deep within that darkness, was watching. I knew he was there, laughing at us, seeing us as pieces in an ancient game. The fact that he didn't even care about our struggles, our attempts to resist, only intensified the despair. We were insignificant to him now. Just more souls being taken, more pieces he moved on an endless board. The door, now fully open, revealed a darkness so dense it seemed to swallow the very light. There were no stars, no sun. It was as if night itself had become something physical, something that could be touched. The sensation was oppressive, overwhelming. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that crossing that door would mean there would be no return. The true nature of the game would be revealed, and it was something that no one could understand. And then, one by one, the souls began to cross. I saw them dissolve into the darkness, as if they were being swallowed by it. There was no sound, but the sensation of their departure was palpable. It was as if they were leaving their existences behind, ceasing to be people and becoming mere shadows, part of the game, eternally condemned to circle within that unchanging cycle. I knew, with growing terror, that soon it would be my turn. There was no more turning back. I tried to resist, tried to pull away, but something was pulling me in. It was no longer a choice. The game had already decided my fate. The shadows were stronger now, surrounding me. They whispered, moved around me, touched my skin. It was as if they were trying to remind me of who I had been, of who I was. But deep down, I knew those memories were already fading. The game had erased me, and I was now part of it, a lost piece, a soulless entity. When the last soul passed through the door, I felt the pressure increase. The shadows disappeared, the darkness closed around me, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Then, without warning, a light appeared before me. It was faint, distant, but enough to make me feel a small ray of hope. I moved closer, but as I approached, I realized it wasn't just any light. It was the light from the board. The game was beginning again. The board was there, immense, stretching before me. Every piece was in place, and the game was ready to continue. The devil was laughing, but his laugh was no longer audible. It was a presence, a force that spread through everything around me, a feeling of inevitability. I knew that now there was no escape. The game was resetting, and I would be part of it forever. The pieces began to move on their own. It was as if the game was coming to life, as if it were alive. I now was part of it. There was no more I, just an entity, a piece on the board. The light around me grew brighter, blinding, and I could no longer distinguish what was real and what was part of the game. It was as if I was falling into an abyss, an endless spiral, where each movement only took me deeper, into something even greater, more terrible. The sensation of being consumed was overwhelming. I was losing the ability to distinguish my own emotions, my own memories. And then, the devil's voice appeared again. It was no longer distant. It was inside me, inside everything I felt. "Welcome back," he said, and this time, his voice was cold, full of pleasure. "You thought you could escape, didn't you? But you're already lost. You always were lost." I tried to scream, but there was no voice. There was no more I. I was becoming a piece, a shadow on the board. The darkness consumed me, and I knew there was no way back. The cycle, that endless cycle of lost souls and eternal games, was about to begin again. But I was no longer a soul. I was no longer a person. I was a piece. I am a piece, and the game never ends. I was in a sort of trance. I no longer knew where my consciousness ended and where the game began. Everything had become a tangled mess of thoughts and fragmented images. The shadows, the souls, the devil, they were all inside me, and I was inside them. The board stretched out before me, and I knew there was no choice anymore. I was no longer playing. I was the game. What terrified me the most wasn't being trapped. It no longer surprised me. What consumed me was the emptiness. Inside, a feeling that couldn't be described in words. The game had erased all my memories. I didn't remember who I was, where I came from, or what would happen if I lost. The game had left me with nothing. I was a piece of something larger, a cog in a mechanism that moved on its own. And then, the pieces began to move. Not of their own will, but because the game commanded them. Each movement, each play, felt like another step towards something irreversible. But for some reason, I knew the final move was near. Something deep inside me told me that the end was close. Or rather, near a new beginning, a repetition, a renewal of the cycle. I watched, unable to react, as the shadows moved around me. They were no longer just shadows of lost souls. They were parts of the game itself, creatures formed by the energy of the board. They watched, waited, always waiting. But I knew they were not like me. They were the ones who had already been consumed, who had already been shaped by the game. They were trapped here, and around me, the game was starting to transform, to gain a life of its own. I could feel the pieces moving, as if they had a will of their own, as if they were being controlled by a force that could not be seen. The light from the board flickered, the symbols on the pieces began to glow with a terrifying intensity, illuminating the space around me. And in a swift movement, the devil appeared. He was no longer a distant figure. He was right there, in front of me, more real than ever. His features were unclear, but his presence was overwhelming. He didn't speak, but his will was present in every move of the game, in every piece that moved. He didn't need words. His presence spoke for itself. And you still wonder why you're here? His voice echoed in my mind, but it wasn't like any human voice. It was as if the sound came from all sides, from both inside and outside of me. As if the devil was the very essence of the game, and I was nothing more than an extension of it. You've always been here. You've always been part of the game. You have no more place to go. I wanted to scream, to rebel, but something inside me, something that now seemed completely in tune with the board, stopped me. I knew the devil's words were painful truths, unavoidable. The game had already consumed me. I was already trapped in it, and there was no turning back. I watched the pieces move again, one after another, all rearranging in patterns I couldn't understand. Each move was a sentence. With every piece that moved, I felt a part of me was being lost, fading away. I was becoming a piece, a shadow, a reflection of something that existed only to serve the game. "This is what you've become now," said the devil, and his voice filled the space around me. "You are part of the game, a piece that will always be moved, always be used. There is no more freedom, no more choice. There is no more you." His words were venomous, but they were the truth. I felt my humanity slip through my fingers, flowing like sand, as if I were melting away. I was no longer a person. I was nothing. The game had transformed me into something formless, something that no longer had an identity, only a function in that endless cycle. I looked at the board again. The pieces were glowing. The shadows were dancing around them, waiting, watching, as if everything was preparing for another round, another cycle, another game. And somewhere, far away, something else was moving. Something much greater than I could understand. "The game never ends," said the devil, and this time, his words carried the weight of a sentence. "It continues, and you will continue to be part of it, like all the souls before you. Always." And at the exact moment he said that, something inside me broke. It was no longer a desire to resist. There was no more resistance. It was as if I had finally understood. The game had no end. It didn't need me, but I needed it. I needed the darkness, the repetition, the cycle. I needed to be a piece, a part of this infinity, this abyss that stretched on forever. The devil smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was an acceptance. Because in the end, all that remained was one certainty. The game never ends. I am a piece, and the cycle will always continue. Now, there were no more doubts. I was no longer who I was. I was no longer a person. I was just a shadow, a part of the game, a reflection of the pieces moving on the board. And the feeling of acceptance I felt was not liberating. It was terrifying. I was no longer fighting to escape. I didn't want to escape anymore. I had been consumed by the game, shaped to be a piece in it, and there was no going back. As the pieces moved, the reality around me began to crumble. The board expanded, transformed, and I was dragged, along with the lost souls around me, into this distortion of time and space. The devil, who was no longer a distant and intangible figure, was by my side, watching. He didn't need to manifest anymore, for he had already become a part of me. The darkness seemed to grow around us, becoming even thicker, denser, as if the game itself was spreading through every corner of the universe. The shadows, which had once been vague and distorted shapes, began to take on a more tangible consistency. They were transforming, becoming something larger, something that should not exist. And it was at that moment I realized something I had never fully understood before. The game was not just about the souls it consumed. It wasn't just about the pieces it used. The game was, in fact, the key to something much older, something that transcends space and time. It wasn't just imprisoning souls. It was building a bridge to another place, to another dimension, something far beyond what any of us could comprehend. The game has always been this way, said the devil, his voice resonating with an intensity that seemed to come from every direction at once. It is not just a trap. It is the door, the passage to what lies beyond. I looked at him, speechless, with no clear thoughts. I was seeing the shadows, the souls, the board, everything transforming around me. I was losing my form, my identity, but a part of me was still conscious enough to understand what he was saying. The game was a portal, an opening to something even darker, something that was not just a cycle of lost souls. It was the key to the abyss itself, to the void that existed beyond human understanding. As I looked at the board, the movements of the pieces began to gain a new intensity. They were moving faster, more frantically, as if the match was reaching its climax, as if the fate of the souls was about to be sealed. The devil, with his oppressive presence, seemed to watch with pleasure, knowing the end of the game was near. But it wasn't the end. It wasn't an end as I knew it. The game had no end. It simply transformed, reset, expanded. And I, like all the other souls, was trapped in it, with no idea what would happen when the cycle ended, or if it would ever end. Then, something new happened. Something I hadn't expected. The board, which had been glowing with a dark light, started to change. The pieces, which had once been stuck in their places, began to rearrange, as if they were being reorganized by an invisible force. I could feel that something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. The game was transforming, but in a way I couldn't comprehend. The darkness around us began to condense, becoming thicker, more solid. And I saw, at the center of the board, a hole, an emptiness. An emptiness that wasn't just physical, but something much deeper. Something that was the true center of the game. I knew then that all of this, the devil, the pieces, the lost souls, was just a facade. The game wasn't about us. It was about something greater. Something beyond comprehension, beyond anything any of us could imagine. This is the end of a cycle, said the devil, and his voice was filled with something much darker than I had ever felt. But remember, there is no end. The cycle always begins again. I was completely absorbed. I was no longer a person. I no longer had a soul. I was no longer anything. Just a part of the game, a piece in a match that would never end. The whole. In the center of the board expanded, and I knew then that I was being pulled into it. There was no more resistance, no more control. I was being consumed by the darkness. And when the emptiness engulfed me, I no longer knew what happened. There was no more space for thoughts, no more space for fears. There was only the game, and I, an eternal peace, falling deeper and deeper, while the cycle began again, once more. But then, amid the darkness, one last doubt formed. One last question that would torment me forever. What if the game had never started? What if, somehow, we had always been here, just waiting to be played? In the end, there is only one certainty. The world we see... Maybe it isn't all that exists. Comment what you think. And if you have the courage, come back tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you. But remember, some stories never end.